Oddworld Soulstorm is quite a fascinating game. It's the latest entry in the fairly renowned Oddworld series and the first entry to appear on the modern generation of consoles. It is a sequel to 2014's Oddworld New and Tasty and is a reimagining of the 1998 PC and PlayStation game Oddworld Abe's Exoddus, similar somewhat to how New and Tasty was a reimagining of the first Oddworld game, Abe's Odyssey. It was both developed and published by Oddworld Inhabitants and was released on PC, PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 on April 6, 2021. It was made using the Unity engine, making it one of the first real examples of a high-budget game made using the engine on the modern generation of consoles. It was first announced in April 2015, but it wasn't clear if it had fully entered production at that point. Though considering its original release date was planned for a late 2017 release, it's fairly safe to assume as much. The game received multiple delays over the course of its development, which suggests a somewhat troubled development cycle, though it might also be possible that development was restarted at some point during the game's conception in order to develop the game with the PlayStation 5 in mind. Or perhaps there were just some drastic design and story changes that required a full restart. The question is then, after all the delays, was the wait worth it, and is Oddworld Soulstorm a great remake of a PC and PlayStation classic that manages to bring the series into the new generation with a bang, or does it putter out as little more than a whimper? Well, let's dive into Oddworld Soulstorm and find out. As always, I'll be taking a look at the story, the gameplay, the graphics and performance, as well as the music and sound of the game, before offering some final thoughts on the game itself and concluding the video. For the purposes of this video, I played through the game on PlayStation 5, taking advantage of it being free with PlayStation Plus for the month of April. I played the game a total of 2 times, so I ended up abandoning my second playthrough halfway through for reasons I'll get into later in this video. In my first playthrough, I obtained the bad ending for the game, so whilst this is mostly a comprehensive review, I haven't played the last 2 levels in the game which are locked behind the good ending, though I have seen the good ending on YouTube, so I know what happens narratively. I personally haven't really played any of the other Oddworld games myself prior to Soulstorm, though I did play a little bit of New and Tasty a few years ago, so I'm fairly new to the series as a whole, and I haven't really played many stealth platformers before, so this game will be a new experience for me going into it. The reason I'm playing it now is because it was always a series that intrigued me due to its odd character designs and how interesting Oddworld is as a world, with its many species and strong dystopian, capitalistic and authoritarian undertones. Oddworld Soulstorm is set after the events of Oddworld New and Tasty, where Abe, the protagonist of the game, successfully leads a revolt at the Rupture Farms factory, freeing his fellow Mudokons working there after discovering a nefarious plot orchestrated by the factory's CEO, the greedy Gluckon Moloch, whom wanted to use Mudokons as ingredients in a range of Mudokon-themed products. The story of the Soulstorm picks up shortly after that, with Abe and the rescued Mudokons celebrating their liberation. That is, until their safe haven is suddenly barraged by a vengeful Moloch, whose reputation is in tatters due to the other Gluckons believing that he purposefully destroyed Rupture Farms and his Mudokon employees as part of an elaborate insurance scam, due in part to their arrogance making it impossible for them to even fathom that the Mudokons would ever rebel against them. So, Abe and the other Mudokons escape from Moloch's attack and make their way through the world of Oddworld, freeing other Mudokons and discovering various conspiracies that explain in greater detail some of the more important elements of the narrative, such as why the Gluckons are so adamant in their belief that the Mudokons are incapable of rebelling against them. Oddworld Soulstorm has 2 main endings, those being bad and good endings, which are obtained by obtaining bad or good Korma in a certain amount of levels respectively, with extra epilogue newspaper headline montages for each ending, unlocking for getting bad Korma in almost every level, or getting good Korma in every level depending on what ending you get. I'll explain what Korma is when I talk about the gameplay of Soulstorm in more detail later in this video, But to summarise, it's mainly just a way of checking how many fellow Mudokons Abe manages to save or kill during a level. Soulstorm's story is quite interesting for what it is, and it touches on fairly complex topics such as slavery and capitalistic oppression in an interesting and sometimes thought-provoking way. The dialogue is great, with some really clever writing that balances the comedic and serious natures of the story and character interactions perfectly. One thing I really liked was that during some levels, as you explore the detailed environments, you often hear news broadcasts where a reporter will elaborate on some of the ongoing plot threads and remind the player of the current situation, and in some cases even build on the superb world building by giving biased criticisms towards certain characters that helps to showcase the predatory and often biased nature of Oddworld's media conglomerates.
Blame on this poor Abe guy. A former employee of the month, Abe is now just a smoldering pile of bones. Although we are still waiting to verify his death. More details to follow.
The world building in general is easily the greatest aspect of the Oddworld series as a whole, with the way all of the games showcase the various different races in the world and how they are treated by others in an authoritarian capitalistic dystopian society, with all of the areas in the world helping to drive home the dark and dreary nature of Oddworld. Admittedly, it's not all great, as the story is somewhat in the background for the first half of the game, which focuses on Abe evading Moloch's airship and hijacking a train in order to meet up with the rest of the Mudokons he was with during the beginning of the game. As such, the first half of the game doesn't really give you much to encourage you to push forward with the game's story, which is a serious issue due to how slow and somewhat tedious the level structures and gameplay can feel in Soulstorm. This tedium is perfectly encapsulated when you examine the trophy statistics for Oddworld Soulstorm on PlayStation 5 and discover that the trophy that pops when you complete level 8, around the halfway point of the game as of the writing of this video, only has a completion rate of 4.3%, indicating that only that percentage of players have reached that point in the game. This gets worse when you consider the completion rate for the game's bad ending is at 0.1%, and the completion rate for the game's good ending is only 0.7%, which means that only around 0.8% of players have actually finished the game as of 2 months after release. Oddworld Soulstorm isn't a long game either, as a good ending run should take on average around 20 hours to achieve, give or take. It's just the way the story is paced and the tedious and often buggy nature of the gameplay, which I'll go into more detail with in a bit, actively hampers most players' interest in seeing the game through to the end. It's why I abandoned my second playthrough of the game, as I just couldn't bring myself to slog through the game again with how long some of the levels are and how draining it feels to play through despite the mostly compelling narrative. It's a real shame when you consider the insane quality of some of the cinematics used in the game to help push the story forward. The cutscenes in Oddworld Soulstorm are one of the aspects of the game that really helps to showcase the strength of its narrative and world, as quite a few chapters are bookended by really well shot, pre-rendered cutscenes that in my opinion are movie caliber in terms of their direction, graphical fidelity and general animation quality. That being said, whilst these cutscenes are visually incredible and are absolutely brilliant at showing character motion and pushing the story forward in a cinematic and entertaining way, the cutscenes during levels where they utilise the in-game assets are pretty much the opposite, with little to no animation, and the cinematography can be summarised by slightly zooming in the play area camera a bit. These cutscenes are unskippable too, unlike the pre-rendered cutscenes, which does make replaying the levels a bit tiresome, though replaying the levels in general, as I'll get into in a bit, feels tiresome and a little dull anyway, so it's just making a small problem worse. All in all though, the story to Oddworld Soulstorm is probably one of its greatest qualities, with some really solid writing and gorgeously animated cutscenes. The pacing is fairly awful for the first half of the game, and it does detract from the overall quality as a result, and whilst it does pick up as you head towards the end, the overly long levels tend to make it difficult to want to see it through to the end because of that. The actual content in the story is really good though, and I really enjoyed the story when it did happen. It's just the story sections are way too spread out to keep one's interest for too long. The gameplay of Oddworld Soulstorm is quite interesting in its implementation, and it's something that's quite unique to the Oddworld series, that I haven't really seen done anywhere else. Oddworld Soulstorm is primarily a 2.5D stealth platformer where you'll sneak through highly detailed environments, avoiding enemies, traps and various other obstacles as you attempt to rescue the captive Mudokons and reach the end of the stage. The movement in Soulstorm mainly feels like an evolution of the previous Oddworld games in the sense that Abe can jump, double jump, crouch, roll, sneak and climb up and down various platform edges. You can also hide in lockers and interact with objects such as levers, switches and elevators, as well as obtain materials from bins and lockers that you can then use to craft various items that can be used to help you evade the various obstacles in your way. Abe can also chant, which allows you to activate certain doors or possess enemies in order to get past obstacles. Sadly, you'll rarely find opportunities where chanting is something that is actually useful, as only a few levels have doors that can be opened by chanting, and in almost every area where there are enemies, you'll find that there are also indestructible anti-chant orbs that electrocute you if you attempt to chant near it. Items that can be used to evade the sligs and other enemies in your way include rocks and bouncy balls, which can be used to knock out enemies, as well as Soulstorm brew bottles, which can be thrown on the ground and set alight to kill anything caught in the blaze and destroy obstacles in your way. There are also flamethrowers and fire extinguishers, which do as their names suggest, as well as smoke grenades, which can be used to hide from enemies for a short period of time. For the most part, all of the items are useful in their own way, and you'll find yourself using different ones when the situations demand it, such as in moments where you'll need to use smoke grenades to hide from patrolling sligs and then quickly run past once the coast is clear. You also have to rescue other Mudokons and escort them to safety using commands to tell them to follow you or stop following you. This adds an extra element of challenge to the gameplay, as stealthing around on your own is fairly simple, but when you're often accompanied by increasingly larger groups of Mudokons, stealth becomes a lot more tricky, as the AI on the Mudokons is fairly primitive and mindless, and they don't actively attempt to avoid obstacles as they follow you, and they often do so at a leisurely pace, making time-sensitive moments quite tense and sometimes even infuriating. You can give Mudokons that you find items to use when set to an aggressive mood, but from what I've experienced, they are pretty damn useless, and you're better off just hoarding your items for yourself. Most of the time, rescuing Mudokons will require you to find them in a level, get them to follow you, and then escort them safely to the nearest bird portal, which you can open by chanting to allow the Mudokons to escape safely. You'll want to rescue as many Mudokons as possible, as, like I mentioned earlier in the video, the last couple levels in the game, as well as the good ending, are locked behind getting good karma in a set amount of levels, and obtaining good karma in a level requires you to successfully rescue 80% of Mudokons hidden within it. Thankfully, keeping track of how many Mudokons you've saved or still need to save is fairly easy, as there is a small chart in the bottom left of the level telling you exactly how many have been found, how many have been rescued, how many are following you or standing still, and how many have died. The gameplay loop works for the most part, at least in concept, and it's quite satisfying to successfully evade a group of enemies without being detected, but I can't help but mention that the controls and the general movement in the game is incredibly cumbersome and can be a real pain at times with how finicky and uncooperative it can be. An example of this is pretty much any time involving the edges of ledges in the environment. Lowering yourself down so that you're grabbing the edge is tricky because you need to find the sweet spot for it to actually let you drop down, and it can be a right pain if you're trying to do it in a hurry. Likewise, trying to throw items when holding onto the edge of a ledge is a pain in itself because the aiming system is so unintuitive. Jumping and grabbing ledges can be quite non-cooperative as well at times, with there being many a time where I've attempted to make a jump onto an adjacent platform, yet Abe wouldn't grab the edge and plummeting to his demise. This issue usually crops up when attempting to jump between swinging bars and is always incredibly aggravating when it occurs. The way you interact with objects can be a pain as well at times, such as with the lockers, as the search locker command and the hide in locker command are mapped to the same button, so sometimes when you're attempting to quickly hide from a patrolling enemy, you accidentally search the locker instead of hiding it, leading to your detection and swift demise. There are a lot of cumbersome moments to the way the game's controls work, and whilst I can definitely see some of these issues getting ironed out in future patches, playing it at the moment can be quite a frustrating experience at times. It's not necessarily game breaking for me personally, as the checkpoint system in the game is fairly decent, with frequent checkpoints making it so that death doesn't send you back too far. But it's still an annoyance, and I do hope that a lot of these issues are ironed out a bit in the future. That being said, in regards to the checkpoint system, there are some major flaws with how they've implemented it in this game. For one, when you hit a checkpoint, it doesn't reset enemy placements when you respawn, so in some levels you can get softlocked by accidentally hitting a checkpoint whilst being chased by enemies, dying and then respawning right in the middle of a group of slugs, who quickly gun you down and force you to respawn over and over again. That's not to mention the plethora of glitches I've experienced in the game so far, such as multiple situations where Abe gets shot at whilst hugging a wall, which results in him getting stuck in the wall and can't move or die, requiring a full restart from the last checkpoint, or the many times when the game has crashed or frozen up, requiring a general full restart. There are even a couple of situations where I phased through the floor into areas I shouldn't be able to get to, and get trapped, requiring me to yet again restart from the last checkpoint. It's very frustrating, and it honestly makes me think that the game should have been delayed a couple months to iron these issues out, though considering the COVID pandemic and the fact that this is a fairly low budget game, I can for the most part forgive these issues. It's just kind of, unenjoyable when they do happen. As I mentioned earlier, the artificial intelligence for the Mudokons is pretty lackluster, with most of them just following mindlessly, which honestly, to be fair, isn't that big of a deal, as there are a lot of situations where you can just leave them in a safe spot until you clear a safe path through. But there are also very frustrating sections that feel deliberately unfair, such as in one of the levels near the middle of the game where you have to escort a large group of Mudokons past a row of crushers, with only a very small gap in between acting as a safe zone. The problem is that the Mudokons won't walk right up to you when you're in the safe zone, and the time between each crusher's cycle is very quick, so it's almost impossible to adjust the group so that everyone is in the safe zone in time, and there are multiple crushers to avoid, making for an unfair and almost cruel trial, especially since that level's good Korma requirements are very strict, and the difference between one or two Mudokons dying could result in you ending up with bad Korma. The enemy AI is pretty unremarkable as well, though, with most slugs just following a set path and only diverging from it when they're in a more alert stage, and then returning to their original pathing when the alert stage ends. Sadly, just like with their artificial intelligence, there is also little variety when it comes to enemy types in the game, with there only being a handful of different slugs, including regular slugs, flamethrower slugs, minigun slugs, and then flying variants of those three types. There are also 2 or 3 non-slug enemies as well, but they appear a lot less frequently, and I have to say, with how long this game is, the lack of variety as well as the fact that gameplay doesn't really evolve at all across the entire game, leads to the game being quite the slog to complete. This issue is further compounded by the main criticism that I have with the game, which is the length of the levels. Each level in the game feels like it goes on forever, even though they usually only take 45 minutes to an hour and a half to clear. This is primarily due to just how samey the levels feel in general, which is partially an issue with the visuals, but also the general gameplay mechanics as well, and when we get into it later on in this video, also a problem with the music. The looting system as well, which factors into the crafting menu, also adds to that tedium, with some levels having large amounts of lockers to loot, with a lot being placed immediately after a checkpoint, meaning that if you die, you'd have to re-loot those lockers every single time, which wouldn't be too bad if looting was instant, but it takes a second or two to loot each locker, which, over the course of the game's runtime, can add up substantially, especially during tricky sections where death is an inevitability. Overall, Oddworld Soulstorm's gameplay is alright. It's functional for the most part, but very unpolished. The lack of variety in the enemy types, general level design, and core gameplay, though, prevents it from being great, and it gets very tiring very quickly, to the point that I doubt most players will ever play through to the end. As for the graphics, Oddworld Soulstorm is quite the visual masterpiece, especially on PlayStation 5, which was the system I played it on, and is a really good showcase for what 2.5D platformers could be like visually on the next generation of systems. The character models are all quite quirky, with weirdly proportioned limbs, excellent texture work, and detailed amounts of polygons that all feel like they fit in with the world of Oddworld. That being said, like with a lot of my complaints with the game, there is a distinct lack of variety when it comes to the character models, as most of the Sligs and Modokons look the same throughout. The Glukkons admittedly do look slightly more unique, though even then they only really appear during cutscenes and there's not many of them, and since they're pre-rendered they don't use in-game assets and as such are naturally a lot more detailed and unique in their appearances. Where the game truly shines, however, is the environments and backgrounds of the levels in the game, as you'd probably expect from a series renowned for its incredibly solid world building. Each level takes place in a 2.5D environment, in the sense that it's not for the most part a 2D side-scrolling platformer, but on pathways that are not always just a linear straight line, with the camera sometimes even changing angles to give the illusion of more depth. As such, you'll often find that some of the levels are built into the background as opposed from just simply having a strictly horizontal level design. By that I mean that often you'll be running across the level and you'll notice later parts of the level in the background, which, honestly, is really cool. Being able to see what comes next off in the distance gives you something to work towards, as well as helps to emphasize that these locations are actual places with huge amounts of depth and density to them. The environments themselves, though, from an artistic point of view, are all gorgeous, with excellent texture work and detail that helps to strengthen the world building, especially as all of the assets and environments are consistent to the game's core art style and nothing feels out of place. Admittedly, some of the game assets such as the platforms, interiors and traps are reused heavily throughout the game, which may enhance the feelings of tedium and repetition that pervade a large portion of this game, but by and large the actual environments are unique, with gorgeous canyons and mountains to more industrial factory settings and warehouses. Visually, there's something to really enjoy with the game. The colour palette used in Oddworld Soulstorm is mostly a blend of darker colours such as browns, greys and greens, which suits the setting perfectly due to the aforementioned environment types, and the use of colour definitely helps to enhance the consistency of the world and the various areas of Oddworld, which is the most important thing, though I personally feel that for a stealth platformer, these darker gritty colours kind of make the game feel a little dull at times. Performance-wise, as mentioned prior, the game is plagued with bugs and glitches, ranging from slight visual errors to more frustrating ones such as crashes and freezes. Thankfully though, the load times for the game are pretty superb on PlayStation 5, with most only taking a couple seconds to get you back into the action, which alleviates a lot of the frustration when the various bugs and glitches force you to restart the game or from a checkpoint. The frame rate is pretty great too for the most part, mostly sticking to a solid 60 from what I could tell, so thankfully the high visual fidelity does not impact the general performance at all. Overall though, Oddworld Soulstorm has a great visual style that for the most part is the best aspect of the game, with cutscenes and environments that are stunning, character models that are detailed and full of charm, and whilst there are plenty of bugs and glitches to be found here, even a couple months after launch, the general frame rate and load times for the most part more than make up for that. The soundtrack of Oddworld Soulstorm was in my opinion one of the weakest aspects of the game, with a really weak track selection that was so immemorable and uninspired that for most of my time with the game I didn't even notice any of the music as I was playing. It wasn't until I looked up and listened to some of the tracks online that I discovered that Soulstorm even had a soundtrack. That being said, even then all the tracks for the most part sound the same, with many levels sharing the same tracks, and the ones that have unique tracks sound similar to the rest of the tracks in the game. If I were to play any of the tracks in the game and ask you to name the level in which it played, you wouldn't be able to do it because they all sound so similar and make almost no memorable impact. I know I'm being quite harsh on the soundtrack, but for comparison I went and checked out the soundtrack to Abe's Exoddus, which Soulstorm is a reimagining of, and was blown away by how good the soundtrack to that game was, which is why I'm so critical about Soulstorms. Each track in Exoddus was distinctly unique and made each level a lot more enjoyable to play through, whereas the tracks in Soulstorm are so repetitive and generic that it makes an already fairly boring and tedious game even more so. Music is an important part of any video game due to how it can be used to set the tone during cutscenes, get the player invested in the gameplay, as well as help showcase the incredible environments by using music to make them seem more impressive. However, Soulstorm really doesn't seem to understand that, and it greatly suffers as a game because of it. While we're on the topic of sound, the game does a pretty decent job when it comes to sound effects, though again, like most aspects of the game, it's not without its caveats. In terms of the quality of the sound effects, they're pretty great and they help to add tension to some scenes and help to add to the immersion of each level. Different sounds play, for example, depending on the material or the flooring Abe walks across, with metal grating causing a somewhat echoey rattling sound and more normal thick flooring causing little to no sound at all aside from the pitter-patter of feet. The issue with the sound again mainly comes down to an assortment of bugs and glitches I discovered while playing, such as one really horrible one where I killed one of the vicious dog enemies in the game and their dying yelps repeated for the rest of the level, or until I returned to the main menu and jumped back into the level, which I have to say, as someone who really likes animals and who recently had to put down a dog themselves, hearing a dog's painful yelps over and over again was a really uncomfortable thing. Other issues I experienced with the sound were some glitches where sound effects played louder and at a lower quality than usual, or not at all. Otherwise, for the most part, the sound in Soulstorm is fairly substandard, yet not bad. The voice acting for the various characters, such as the Modokans, Sligs and Gluckons, is fine, though again somewhat lacking in variety. All the Sligs, for instance, sound the same, kinda like the battle droids in the Star Wars prequel trilogy, complete with inane comedic buffoonery and fairly generic repetitive voice lines. The main characters have good enough voice acting, which helps to make them more likeable or hateable depending on their morality, and it helps to emphasize the emotional weight of an already superb story. Interestingly, the aforementioned news report bulletins that sometimes play during levels where reporters talk about the goings-on in the world refrain from using actual trained voice actors for the reporters. Instead, they decided to hire various YouTubers or games journalists such as Kadikarus or Greg Miller for the roles, as a cool set of cameos. Thankfully, they all do a great job with the limited roles they're given, and they fit in well with the rest of the voice cast fairly seamlessly. Overall, the sound and music of Oddworld Soulstorm is a mixed bag, with the soundtrack being incredibly uninspired and forgettable, but with excellent general sound design and voice acting, despite several bugs and glitches that are still present over 2 months since its release. Oddworld Soulstorm is such a difficult game to review because it has a lot of potential and there are a lot of positive aspects to it, such as the great story and excellent world building, to its gorgeous graphics that really show off what a platformer can be this generation. But for every good thing the game has going for it, it also has a lot holding it back from truly being great. The gameplay, for example, whilst good on paper, is way too finicky in its implementation, with sometimes uncooperative controls and iffy collision detection. The stealth aspect is fun initially, but bogged down by too many sections where you have to fight your way past enemies instead of sneak past them, which gradually gets more annoying and tedious to deal with the further into the game you get, and the difficulty of those sections ramp up, due to the aforementioned finicky controls and generally poor combat mechanics in general. To compound with that, the poor pacing the first half of the game has, and the overbearing length of some of the levels, as well as the very repetitive environments, general colour palette and incredibly generic soundtrack, it makes it very difficult to not get burnt out playing through the game for longer than a level at a time, and for me at least, playing through the game often felt more like a chore than one of genuine enjoyment. The plethora of bugs, glitches and issues experienced throughout the game, still very frequent even a month or two after release, make the gameplay experience all the more tiresome, cumbersome and downright unenjoyable and infuriating at times as well. It's a game that I really wanted to enjoy as I was playing through it, as I was quite invested in the world, but its problems were just way too many despite its many qualities. As such, I can't really advise purchasing it unless you find it on a sale, even if you're a fan of the Oddworld series, as I personally do not think it is an experience worth paying full price for. If you can get it on a sale or discount, or you manage to nab it through PlayStation Plus when it is available for free, then you might as well give it a shot just to see if it might be something you'd enjoy playing through, as it does have a lot of good qualities and you might be able to appreciate them more than I did, and see past the flaws that the game has. Even so, I think if you're new to the series and would like to try an Oddworld game for the first time, I'd recommend just playing any of the older games in the series, which, from my understanding, are all incredible games with stellar stories, worlds, and gameplay, even if some have aged a lot worse than others. I haven't been completely turned off by the Oddworld series by my time playing through Soulstorm, as I really do love the world and the characters and the story, so I'm definitely going to try out some of the old Oddworld titles now that I've tried a bit of Soulstorm, and I am looking forward to seeing what the developers do next in terms of the Oddworld series in general, whether it's a reimagining of Munch's Odyssey or just a new game in general that actually progresses the story. I'm excited to see what they do next, because the world itself and the stories are captivating and the characters are all very likable and interesting in their designs, so I think, provided they learn from the mistakes they made with Soulstorm, I think that there is the potential for the Oddworld series to have quite a positive future, but we'll just have to see. But that's it for this review. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to support the channel and avoid missing out on any future videos. Likewise, comment below with your thoughts on the video or on Oddworld Soulstorm itself, as always I'm curious to see what you all thought of both. Until next time guys, this has been Kingdom H and thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video.